I'm Jarrett Murphy from citylimits.org.
And I'm Ben Max from Gotham Gazette. And today, in our latest video issue brief in the 2021 elections, we're talking about aging policy, older New Yorkers, and a graying city. Senior citizens are obviously already a big part of New York City, a segment that, with any luck, every New Yorker will be able to eventually experience. And their presence is only getting bigger. Projections are that over the decade we're now in, the 65 plus population will grow at about 16%, 5 times faster than the city as a whole. The pandemic might have disrupted some of those trends, maybe even made the graying city accelerate. But by 2040, there's expected to be 1.4 million senior citizens in New York City, about the size of present day Dallas. So this is usually, these issues and these policies that impact older New Yorkers usually don't get that much attention, don't get that much media spotlight. Every election for mayor, there's maybe one or two forums that you host, Jarrett, that give some attention here. City Limits does a lot of great reporting on this. Candidates love to visit senior centers, and those are closed this year. And the campaigning around appealing to seniors who vote a lot is far more limited as we engage in this election.
And I think as we engage in it, I'm reminded that a lot of the social safety net that we have today, a lot of what we consider big government in this country and in the city, revolve around the issue of aging, and especially what was the reality in the early and mid 20th century, which was an epidemic of poverty among older people. That's a big reason why FDR launched the Social Security program. That certainly was a central reason to President Johnson during the Great Society creating the Medicare program. And those efforts largely succeeded. Poverty among older Americans, older New Yorkers, dropped significantly. I think nationwide it dropped 70% over the 50 years since the Great Society. So it did have that impact. On the local level, some of the programs during the Johnson era around aging and other forms of community engagement led to the creation of the city's Office of the Aging during the Lindsay administration. And that became the Department for the Aging during Mayor Beam's time in office. And so that began sort of a local focus on those issues affecting older New Yorkers. And these changes in policy, and also obviously changes in medicine and nutrition and lifestyle and public safety, have led to a demographic revolution, which is that everyone is living a lot longer. As Ben mentioned, the population is rising mainly because people are, not because young people are moving out of the city, but because old people are living longer. Between 1960 and 2015, life expectancy for the total population increased about 10 years, from 69 or 70 years to 79.4 years. So that's a great thing. That's a tremendous thing. We're all living, or most of us are living much longer. It's an amazing boon for individual people. But for government and for workplaces and for families and old aging individuals, it also creates some serious challenges.
Yeah, New York City obviously always is fairly unique, although there's a lot of cities with similar situations. But there's unique challenges here. There's unique advantages for New York City in dealing with an aging population. The density of the city allows for a lot of services, sort of a rich web of these senior centers that are mentioned that people are eager to see reopen as hopefully more and more older New Yorkers are vaccinated and things are safer coming out, hopefully, of the worst of the pandemic. The pandemic, again, the impact on what the city's demographics look like is still to be seen. Obviously, COVID really preyed on older people and people with underlying conditions, and often there's a combination there. But then we also saw, an apparent real slow in the birth rate, which could have impacts in the long term in terms of what the population looks like. So some of those trends we'll see if the pandemic interrupted them. But aging in New York City comes with huge burdens. There's obviously the advantages of a huge social safety net, of a very active city government. But getting around New York City is extremely difficult. And there's challenges of all kinds in terms of the transit system, but also just navigating the streets, navigating all the tall buildings that we have. When there's elevators that go out at NYCHA complexes, for example, there's all sorts of challenges for older New Yorkers, even as many get to, experience a lot of the benefits of what New York City does for seniors, and then just has to offer for people of all ages and older people.
And I think one thing that people who operate in this policy area are always quick to mention is that this is an issue that intersects with basically every other issue. So all the things we talk about in terms of challenges New York City faces generally are also grafted onto aging. The fact that New York City has a fairly large number of undocumented immigrants, obviously that is especially complicating for older New Yorkers in terms of what kind of benefits and services they can access. The fact that New York City has a fairly large low-income population obviously means a lot of seniors are also in or close to that status, and that obviously poses challenges for them chiefly, but also for government. So that helps to kind of create the background that recent mayors have operated in. And there has been a recognition by many mayors, and especially the last two, that this is an issue that's not only important, but changing, becoming perhaps more important as the city grays. Mayor Bloomberg had something called the Age-Friendly NYC Initiative. This was sort of a creation of a strategy for aging policy, bringing different forces and voices together to map out how the city could make itself more age-friendly, with some policies flowing from that. Mayor de Blasio is spending more money on aging and services for the aging than his predecessor, and that's earned him some credit, but obviously some criticism too. Criticisms about the ways that the contracts for senior meals have worked and the amount of burden that places on the nonprofits that manage that program. A lot of criticism on housing, the role of senior housing in his housing plan, especially when it comes to NYCHA, which in many cases forms its own kind of senior housing. And especially during the pandemic, questions about the funding and the array of services at senior centers, the question of whether and how we're going to get services at senior centers back up and running, because that's such a lifeline for older New Yorkers, and it's been closed obviously since the early days of the pandemic. Just in recent days, Mayor de Blasio has announced a large stream of funding, a new stream of funding called a community care plan, a 5-year plan that involves maybe creating 25 additional either older adult centers or NORCs, naturally occurring retirement communities, which is basically where they locate services where older New Yorkers just kind of are. Kind of a elegant plan the city has had for years. De Blasio has talked about putting more funding on that, organizing more of those NORCs, as well as solitary standing senior centers. So he has in some ways laid a foundation for the next mayor to jump onto, but there are a lot of other issues and challenges that mayor is going to have to deal with.
Right. And, again, another example where Mayor de Blasio in his last year is setting up all these plans that are multi-year plans. In some respects that makes sense. You want to put funding in a budget that's going to last a while, but in some ways, the next mayor is really going to reevaluate so much of what goes on, even as city government hurdles ahead, at least in the first, months, if not year or so of the next mayor's term. But when we talk about an aging city, when we talk about older New Yorkers, there's a whole host of challenges. We've outlined some of them in the initial portion of this discussion, but there's really a significant number. And a couple of the things that immediately come to mind, I mentioned earlier: transit, getting around the city, accessibility of the subways, ability to have access to the buses, and then other forms of transportation that are needed, for older New Yorkers, and just the curb cuts, getting around the city. If anybody, needs, supplementary help to get around, those are often very challenging in New York City. And then the housing issue, isolation during the pandemic has been significant, but that's always an issue. It's just one of those other ones that has been heightened during COVID. What are the ways that the city can help combat that? That also includes making sure to close the digital divide further and get access to technology for seniors. And we hit on this thing about housing, but there's also this question of how to best suit city housing policy to both make sure that older New Yorkers can afford a nice place to live, but also, there's all sorts of issues around older people, very often women who live longer than men, living alone in these large apartments that are either rent regulated or in NYCHA, and how to best use, the city's housing stock without being insensitive to older people who want to stay in their homes. That ties into, as you said, these are all connected to larger issues.
Totally. And obviously income underlies a lot of them. And, people have talked for years about the adequacy of Social Security, whether it's going to be there for people who are retiring, especially when people your age and mine begin entering that phase of life. The adequacy of those benefits, even as they stand now. Obviously, some New Yorkers have pensions, some have 401ks, some don't. So there's been talk on the local level of trying to create something more of a retirement safety net, a retirement income support. That's been discussed. The workplace comes into this in a few different ways. Aging people, older adults face a lot of discrimination in getting promoted and keeping their jobs, certainly in finding new jobs. And there are problems in the workplace that serves those people. It's a workforce that's primarily women of color. Many of them are very poorly paid, many of them paid poorly under city contracts. And so there are some large shortages in that sector because of that. So that's a huge issue too. Elder abuse, the fear of street crime is very real in a lot of these areas. And then the biggest puzzle is really, well, there are many big puzzles, but perhaps the most challenging on a human level as well as financial is the long-term care question. And this is something so many families are wrestling with. One consequence of people living longer is that sometimes their physical health keeps them alive, which is a wonderful thing, but their mental faculties may not be as healthy as their physical state. And so you have people dealing with Alzheimer's, other cognitive problems, other forms of disability where they need long-term care. That raises huge cost questions. For many families, the caregiving is done by a spouse or a sibling or a child, and that has massive impacts on family finances, on people's emotional and physical health. And so solving that puzzle is something that obviously the city is not alone confronting, but is something that candidates are going to be asked to talk about. And so far, Ben, we've heard from some of the candidates, Sean Donovan, Maya Wiley, Catherine Garcia, especially specific sort of set-aside plans that either focus exclusively on aging or primarily on aging and the services that aging people need. Other candidates have certainly mentioned older New Yorkers in their other plans for other policy areas, whether that is social benefits or housing, but it's not something that has gotten a lot of attention. There was a forum recently that City Limits helped sponsor where some candidates did make their views more clear, but it's something where I feel there are a lot of questions still out there for candidates to answer.
Yeah, and before we get just into a few of those, I think a couple other things. One, we've seen, again, the pandemic has heightened so many things, and one of them is where does that long-term care happen? Because we've seen how residents of nursing homes were so badly affected by the pandemic, so many killed. That's obviously become a huge controversy for the governor, but it gets at other issues of the care that those homes are able to provide and how safe people are and how well staffed and well funded they are. And a lot of that does come through the state government, but of course the next city government will have a lot to say there too. And then there are issues of home care, what that looks like, who's funding it, who's able to afford it. And then there's also this continuum of older New Yorkers. There are people who are homebound, who, again, the risks around isolation are so much greater. The need to get into the home to do vaccinations is significant, as we've seen during the pandemic. And then there's obviously people living very long lives, extremely active, and it's much more about sort of quality of life, finances, healthcare as people age, what the cityscape looks like, and opportunities, as you got at, to be able to continue to work if they're able to and choose, and all sorts of issues like that. So in terms of the kind of some of the big questions for mayoral candidates and candidates for other offices, as far as I'm concerned, a lot of it does come back to housing, housing affordability, comfort of housing, quality of life. And then also, as I said, connecting that to the city's larger housing stock, the question around whether the city should be building much more sort of senior focused housing to help people move into that housing with supports. And then also that helps free up units for larger families or individuals who need it.
Yeah, that's obviously, I think that is probably the biggest question. Surveys indicate that that is the biggest worry for older adult New Yorkers is the housing question, whether they are homeowners or renters, whether they're in a co-op or a freestanding home, or in a nursing home. That is a huge, huge question tied tightly to services. I think other questions, obviously, as you mentioned before, COVID-19 exposed some real vulnerabilities among older New Yorkers. Hopefully this was a once in a lifetime crisis, but infectious disease is part of life in the city. How are you going to protect older New Yorkers from future pandemics? How are you going to make sure that they are more able to receive vaccines quickly than they were in this case? And then the question of sort of the when you pull back from this issue, what advocates in the aging field say is that one of the main obstacles is the stereotypes that surround aging. The idea that older people are weak, that they are addled, that they are unfriendly, all the kind of stereotypes and stigmas that are there. This feeds not just directly into things like workplace discrimination, but it makes it hard for people to sustain interest in this issue because it's seen as, to quote some people, just not very sexy. So how does the next mayor intend to use their office and the agency that serves the aging to combat stigma and stereotypes and try to create a healthier embrace of this profound and in many ways really wonderful demographic change the city is going to be going through?
And just quickly, as you said, so many of these issues intersect. So not making it that aging is always its own thing, right? That there's not always just these announcements that focus on seniors, but how to integrate that with, other agencies, other city actions and government actions and policies that can show that integration with housing, with cultural life, education, and so much more that makes it, all part of the fabric of the city.
Well, we are coming to the end of this video, but there are 7 more. This is our 8th one. So if you want to binge watch, please go to gothamgazette.com or citylimits.org. You can also visit their websites for other news about the 2021 campaign on this policy issue and others. If you listen to WBAI 99.5 FM every Wednesday at 5, you'll hear Ben and I on the radio. If you have questions or want information about where, when, how, and perhaps why to vote, please go to vote.nyc. And please remember, the primary is June 22nd. Early voting begins June 12th.